Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. If you wait for a few seconds, we should get the end of next door church's bell ringing practice. Regular viewers will know that happens on a Monday night. It should finish at 9 o'clock, which should be like now. Anyway, won't be going on for long. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. And my goodness, have we got a lot to talk about this week. I mean, goodness me, the title of this video was this race fantastic or farcical? And I think we should start right there. So fire in your one-word reviews. Fantastic or farcical? Did you enjoy it? Were you gripped? Were you hooked? Was it box office? Or was the whole thing a bit of a joke? Did it make Formula One look like an absolute clown show? Just fantastic or farcical? Let's get going from there, and then we'll pick apart all the various incidents all the way through, and there are so many of them right across the weekend. So let's go. What are we saying? Fantastic. Fantastic, says Jan Lotval. Farcical, says Samir Shulk. Fantastic, farcical, farcical, fantastic. That looks to me, a lot of farcicals coming through. It looks to me in that very, very quick snap poll, a mixture, but to me it looks heavily biased in that very short section that we've taken there on the farcical side. And I have to say, I kind of agree. I think it was a box office event. I think it was one of those that we will remember and talk about for a long, long time. And in this context of this epic 2021 season, I mean, should we expect anything else? It's had a little bit of everything across the course of this season, and maybe at some point we needed to have a race like that. It's fitting of what is unbelievably unarguably an incredible year. But I do think there were a lot of elements over the course of this weekend that didn't show Formula One in a good light. It was almost, I heard somebody describe it as the Netflix Drive to Survive, but live on a Sunday. It was like had bits of it, elements that were Hollywooded up just for entertainment spectacle. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's almost the perception that a lot of people took from it, and I can kind of understand that. So we'll pick through all of the little incidents that happened, all of the major incidents, try and go through it piece by piece. Excuse me. There we go. The bells have stopped. That's better. We'll go through the whole thing, and I know that opinion is going to be split. If you're a Max Verstappen fan, you're going to have a very different opinion to whether you're a Lewis Hamilton fan. If you're a neutral, just loving the sport right now, maybe you've got a different view altogether. I'm going to give you my views, and I know that many of you will thoroughly and strongly disagree with those views, and that's absolutely fine. Some of my views might surprise some of you, but we'll give you them all the way through. And of course, what I want is your views in return. I want to know what you think to all these major moments as well. Let's start by talking very quickly about the circuit. The circuit itself, I thought, was spectacular, incredibly fast. What a job they did to build it in such a short period of time. Then he started building that circuit in May of this year. That is amazing, and have the event go pretty much from an organisational perspective pretty smoothly. I think, that's hats off to all the team behind that. A circuit that, yes, it can have some tweaks. It could definitely do with some tweaks moving forward to encourage overtaking and perhaps to increase safety as well. But I thought, what a great spectacle, what a good addition to the calendar. So that's my view on that. Anyone, any quick views on that? Okay, so no, lots of people just jumping straight in with all the Max versus Lewis stuff. I mean, maybe we should just go there. Should we get that out of the way? Let's go in the weekend in reverse. So let's start by talking about the race, and maybe we should start with perhaps the biggest talking point of all, the collision between the two. Why don't we just go straight in? Let's not muck about, we'll go straight in there. The moment where Lewis Hamilton collided with the back of Max Verstappen's car. Now, I know there were other moments after that. I know there were plenty of moments before it, but let's go in with that one because it's a big one. My take on that, right, is this. This was two of the world's best drivers, in my opinion, acting very childish, childlike. Both of them, I'm saying here. And I think, and I'll tell you my view on the penalty that Max got in a moment. Max Verstappen knew exactly what he was doing. He was slowing down to give the place back to Lewis as he'd been instructed to do so. But he did that with a very clear view that he wanted to be behind Lewis, yet within a second of Lewis at the DRS line. I think most people can agree, at least to some extent, that's what was going through Max's mind. That's why he slowed down to such an extent at that part of the racetrack. So that's the first thing. Now, whether you think that in itself is dangerous, slowing to such a degree on a very fast straight, there's an argument to say that it could well be. You don't need to do that to let a driver pass, and you wouldn't normally even do that to let a driver pass. That could be deemed dangerous driving. We've seen drivers over the course of qualifying be very clearly told not to go slowly, unnecessarily slowly, around a very fast part of the racetrack like that. So why is it okay in the race? Should that not have been a penalty or at least some kind of infringement in itself? So that's Max Verstappen slowing down. That's to give the place back. Now, we know that there was confusion in terms of communication and that at first, at least, Lewis wasn't aware Max was giving the place back. However, and this is where many of you will disagree with me, I'm sure, I don't buy the fact that Lewis was just confused and that's why he stayed behind Max. Lewis knew exactly what he was doing. He also, in the same way Max didn't want to reach that DRS line first, Lewis didn't want to reach that line first either, for the very same reasons, and I believe they were both playing exactly the same game. The problem here, or the difficulty to get your head around this bit, is that why on earth didn't Lewis Hamilton just blast past Max Verstappen? There were plenty of space. It wasn't like Max was blocking. There was plenty of space to get by. Lewis could have kept his foot down, blasted through. Yes, he'd have got to the DRS line first, but he'd been way more than a second up the road by the time Max had been able to react. I don't get why he didn't do that. The fact that he says he was confused and there was communication issues, okay, there may be a slight element of that, but if you see your main rival slowing on the straight, there are no yellow flags, there's no virtual safety car, or there is no other incident, your main rival starts to slow. What if he's got an engine problem? What if his car's failing? What if he's got a technical failure? You don't slow down and sit behind him. That was very, very orchestrated, and he knew exactly what Lewis was doing in that sense. So from my view, both drivers were playing a very tactical game, a game that doesn't make Formula One look good at all, and both of them, in my view, are playing a game that potentially could cause danger. I mean, I know that there was nobody directly behind Lewis, so from a danger perspective, the fault falls much more with Max Verstappen than it does with Lewis. Max knows he's got a car behind, so slowing down to that extent and then hitting the brakes, absolutely unacceptable, dangerous driving. He needs a penalty for that, in my opinion. But Lewis Hamilton is also driving unnecessarily slowly. And if we're going to start dishing out penalties and warnings for drivers for driving unnecessarily slowly on a very fast part of a very fast racetrack, well then isn't Lewis guilty of something very similar, even though it may not have the same danger applied? There's my take on that incident. The fact that Max hit the brakes is utterly dangerous and unforgivable. I don't believe that it was a brake test in the sense of the word, that he was deliberately trying to encourage Lewis to crash into the back of him. I don't believe that for 1 second. Why on earth would he do that? That's not, the idea is there's no way you can control that. Lewis could have come off way better than Max, and then he goes on to win the championship potentially. So that's not, I don't believe that was ever part of it. I think Max slowed right down, slower, slower, slower. Lewis was just not going by. So in the end, Max decides to stamp on the brakes and say, well, look, I'm going to go walking pace if you're not going to go past me. And at that point, Lewis didn't manage to react in time and ran into the back. How lucky were they to both get away with that and continue to the end of the race? Unbelievable. But there's my views on that one. As I said, I know many of you will disagree, but I want to hear your thoughts on all of that. Lewis was nervous about discovering a yellow flag. I'm sorry, but if you're a racing driver and your main rival starts to slow, what if his car's just temporarily derating? What if he's got a very temporary problem and begins to slow? Are you not going to take the opportunity to overtake and go for the win of that race? You don't hesitate and slow down to that level just in case there might be a yellow flag. The system very clearly warns a driver on their dash if there's a yellow flag, and if there is not one of those, you just keep going and you overtake your man. And as I said, the irony is Lewis could have done that and blasted his way down the racetrack and got way ahead of Max by the time that DRS line came up upon them both. So it was gamesmanship all the way through. That's my opinion on it, and nothing much more than that, in my opinion. So let's see. Yeah, many of you disagreeing. That kind of stunt isn't what you'd expect from the best drivers in the world unless they're dishonest. Look, I don't think it's the kind of behaviour, and this is why I said it doesn't look good for Formula One. It's not the kind of behaviour that we want at the top level of the sport from either of them. And that's not to say that there's any dubious behaviour, but it's gamesmanship, playing the game to try and outsmart the other one, but in a way that for the millions of people watching this sport, for the kids looking up to these guys as heroes, it just doesn't give the sport a good light. It doesn't give a good perception of this sport to others. And you could argue that, well, the rules are the way they are, so of course they're going to try and game them. Of course they're going to try and play to those rules, and there's a good argument to say that that is the case. Maybe they need some clarification on how you can let one driver past another if that's what you've got to do because the stewards or the race controller have suggested you need to do it. Maybe that's the way this needs clearing up. But the point is, it was two drivers playing very, very silly games, trying to go as slowly as possible so as not to overtake each other. So spot on, they both knew what they were doing, absolutely. Probably a bit tactical on both sides, that's what I think, yes. He's worried Max will crash into him, he was weaving. I don't buy that either. Max wasn't weaving. And look, I'm not falling on one side or the other here, I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. I think both drivers made mistakes or certainly were pushed the boundaries this weekend, and we'll cover all of that in a moment. I think in this incident, I don't think Max was weaving actually at all deliberately. I think he was slowing down, probably very intently focused on his own mirrors to see where Lewis is. Don't forget, if he's trying to let Lewis past, he needs to be able to react immediately to be able to hang on to the coattails of Lewis as they do go down the straight if he had overtaken him. So he's intently focused on the mirrors, probably not watching where he's going at all, and possibly veered across the track. It would make no sense for Max to veer and try and get in the way of Lewis. He's trying to give the place back. You know, that's the whole point. He's trying to let Lewis pass. So I don't buy that he's weaving to try and obstruct Lewis. Certainly don't buy that he was trying to cause a collision. I think it was a horrendous mess up on both of their parts, and it looked, you know, far more dubious than it probably was. Max was weaving. Are you blind? It wasn't he wasn't weaving, was he? Yes, he veered into the middle of the track, but okay, why was Max weaving? Why would Max weave? I just don't get why. There's no point in that. If you're trying to let somebody past, why would you then try and not let them past at those kind of speeds? It makes no sense. So I don't buy that, I'm afraid. But obviously you're welcome to your opinions, and we are going to differ on a lot of what happens tonight. This has polarised a lot of people, as many incidents have this season. Max got a penalty. Where's he gone? Max got a penalty for ignoring double wave flags when his dash indicated the track was green in the previous race. The dash display does not overrule the trackside flags. It doesn't, but there were no trackside flags. So, I mean, what are you going to do? Keep tiptoeing around and just in case there's a yellow flag around the corner? I mean, you can't race like that, can you? Yes, we got a technical failure a couple of races ago where the dash displayed something different to the trackside flags, but that's incredibly rare, and there's no way that any driver on the grid can race with a view that there could be a yellow flag around the corner, so I'm going to go incredibly slowly just in case. You can't do that, can you? Yes, I know he was moving. I'm not saying Max wasn't moving. I'm saying he wasn't deliberately weaving to obstruct Lewis, because I just don't understand what point there would be in doing that, that's all. Yes, he moved. Yes, he didn't keep the car straight, but I don't believe it was weaving as such. So is Michael Massey fit for purpose? We're definitely going to get into that in a moment as well. Any more on the collision between the two? Do we think the penalty was fair and correct? I do think that the penalty, or there should be a penalty, particularly for Max Verstappen in this particular instance, because jumping on the brake pedal, whether he intended Lewis to crash into him or not, and I don't believe he did, was just stupid and definitely dangerous. So if you're going to do a manoeuvre that is dangerous, of course you deserve a penalty for that. 10 seconds applied to your race time obviously didn't change the end result, but if you take that aside, would that be a fair penalty in any other given circumstances, whether it changed the race result or not? It's the harshest of the penalties without going to a grid penalty, isn't it? 5-second penalty is for something very minor, typically quite minor. 10 places is a bit more serious. You can equate it to not slowing down for a double waved yellow. Now that's a serious safety infringement, not slowing down for a double waved yellow. That gives a 10-second penalty. That's a safety element. So maybe you could say this is a safety issue. Maybe a 10-place penalty is also fairly, sorry, not 10 places, 10 seconds. I'm getting confused there, aren't I? 10-second penalty in this particular race. It's harsher than a 5-second clearly, but it's not as much as a grid drop for the following race, which perhaps you could have seen. You could have seen that coming. If that had been the penalty, I'm not sure any of us would have looked at that and said it was too harsh. So there's potentially a question mark or an argument to say that, you know, a 10-second penalty that doesn't change the race result. And by the way, I think that's irrelevant. Whether it changes the race result or not, I think is irrelevant. Lewis Hamilton got a 5-second penalty earlier this season when Max went out of the Grand Prix when they collided and yet went on to win the Grand Prix. So that didn't change the result for Lewis. He still went on to win. So I think in some circumstances, or circumstances like that, it's not about what the penalty, what impact that penalty would have. It's about whether the penalty is correctly applied to the infringement. And I think that might be a question mark here. Is that enough? I'm not sure. I don't think it's blatantly wrong, but if it was harsher, I think we'd all sort of say, well, that's fair enough. It was a serious incident. Let me see. If Lewis did that 10 years ago, what penalty would he get? Well, I've no idea. Yes, I know it was a 10-second penalty. Sorry, I appreciate that. That was my mistake. I don't know what would have happened 10 years ago, but yes, times have changed. And, you know, I was watching a football match with my boy last week, and some highlights of an old football match. It was Roy Keane involved, came up. Football fans will know Roy Keane, brutal player, went in with some horrific lunge tackles, well late, above the knee, not even a free kick. So times change and the way people view penalties and infringements change, driving standards change, the way the referees or stewards look at certain incidents change. And so you can't really compare to 10 years ago. But what we can compare stuff to, and I will do in a moment, are you can compare penalties to incidents that were applied earlier this season, for example. That's a much more relevant comparison, and I want to talk about that now because I want to talk about some of these other incidents that happened. I think we've covered that one off, unless anyone... well, a few people saying that Max should have been disqualified for that move, and do you know, I can't really disagree with you. If Max had been disqualified, having deemed that he jumped on the brakes causing that collision, which is how the stewards worded it, unnecessarily applied the brakes strongly on a fast part of the racetrack and caused a collision. Okay, even if you think that's not a deliberate brake test intending to cause a collision, his actions caused one unnecessarily through some dangerous manoeuvres. So if he'd been disqualified, I don't think too many people would have gone, well, that's utterly ridiculous and unfair a penalty. So if you look at how the stewards deemed that incident, they deemed Max to be at fault. They deemed that he committed a dangerous act that then caused a collision. That penalty is fairly open-ended then. You could give as serious or as lenient a penalty as you kind of like. And they've gone somewhere in the middle with a 10-second race time penalty, probably on the lighter side, I would say. Well, there we go. That's that one. We'll cover that one off. That's interesting. That's why Max learns nothing, says Phantom Tetra. Let's just quickly talk about that for a moment, because look, when you're teaching kids right and wrong as a kid, as a parent, sometimes your punishment or the way you deal with an incident is the thing that the kid remembers if they've done something wrong. If they do something wrong and you either slap them with a really big punishment or you give them a really stern talking to, sometimes it might be, as a parent, you express massive disappointment in them, in what they've done. It's those moments that they remember when they go on to have future incidents. It's those moments that tend to shape their future behaviours. It's not about, a little slap on the wrist saying don't do it again, because that very quickly disappears from memory. And there are some similarities to this kind of thing. If you've got some massive incident that we deem to be dangerous, we need to set precedents and stamp it out to make sure that not only that driver knows that they can't do that in the future, but all the other drivers also know that that kind of behaviour, that kind of driving standard would be utterly unacceptable. So there's a good argument to say that if you just give a very lenient penalty that actually did nothing really in the grand scheme of things to Max, is he going to remember that he can't do that again? Is it going to really affect the way that he drives in future? Probably not, would be my guess. Right, I want to move on because we've got so much to cover. So let's talk about some of the other incidents, and I think we can lump some of these together because a few of them were quite similar. And namely what I'm talking about really, and if we give it a general term, the idea of the car on the inside at a corner running the car on the outside of the corner off the track to defend. Let's talk about that. I know there are variations on that, but let's talk about that. Now, can we equate that to what happened back in Brazil with Max versus Lewis, where Max, you could argue, tactically ran Lewis out of room on the outside of a corner, whereby they both ended up going off the track, but Max kept position. That incident in Brazil was deemed to be okay, not even worthy of an investigation by the stewards. And I think that that was a mistake. I thought it was a mistake back then. I thought it was a very surprising decision back then. I thought that it should have at least had an investigation, or we decide that that is absolutely the way we can drive in the future, and therefore everybody knows that that's perfectly okay. But in doing so, we're contradicting some decisions that were made earlier on this very season, where teams and drivers have been penalised for some very similar incidents. So consistency, of course, is what we're after. We get here to this race, and Max, as we know, has done that in a couple of occasions during this Grand Prix, braked very late or outbraked himself and run him and Lewis off the racetrack. Now, may not be exactly the same as what happened in Brazil, but it's very, very similar in a lot of ways. Lewis also, by the way, did that to Max late on in the Grand Prix. Seemingly deliberately opened up the steering towards the end of the race into turn one with Max on the outside and pushed Max off the racetrack. So there are some nuances between all of those incidents, of course. They weren't all the same, but if we're talking about the driver on the inside running the driver off on the outside off the racetrack, i.e. running them out of room, so they have a choice to either literally jump on the brakes and give up the position or run off the track where there's space to do so, are we saying that's okay? Because we kind of did say that was okay in Brazil, and yet here we're saying on some occasions it seems to be okay. It was fine for Lewis to do it. It was fine for Max to do it on certain occasions, and yet on other occasions during the race yesterday, one occasion in particular, Max Verstappen was penalised and asked to give the position back. Now, I know that on the one where he got the penalty, it was for overtaking, where he had to give the position back, it was for overtaking off the racetrack, which is a slightly different offence. I'm talking about the incidents where Max lunged down the inside, on occasion on the outside as well, throwing his car into a risky situation, let's say, to keep position, to maintain position or to gain position on Lewis, and one or the other of them running the other driver out of room. So consistency is what we need. I don't think we got it, and I still don't think going into the final race of the season anyone is any the wiser or any the clearer on what is and what isn't allowed. Let's see your views on this. It's okay if you have the racing line and push, but not a bonsai, I think you mean a banzai move, James Whiteside. Well, but that's a very fine line. So okay if you got the racing line and you push, but not in a banzai move. What are we calling a banzai move? I mean, are we saying that if you keep your car under control and yet your car on the inside ends up squeezing the car on the outside off the racetrack, is that okay as long as you don't lock a wheel? I mean, you've got to have some clear definitions if we're going to nail this and pinpoint it to a point where there's a fine line and a definite line as to what's allowed and what's not. Or we say to them, this is great racing. Let's let them race. I want to see wheel-to-wheel action. I want to see aggressive fighting in these corners. And as long as nobody is out of control, locking up tyres and not under control of their own race car, maybe that's okay. So I don't know what the answer is, but we need to know because we're going into a title deciding race where no one's yet very clear on what exactly the rules are, because they appear to be different at different racetracks this season in different circumstances. So I think that definitely needs clearing up, but I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Hamilton remained on track, Max never did. Well, are we saying that's okay? I mean, is that the rule? Is that what we want to say is okay? Yes, in the incident where Lewis pushed Max off the racetrack, Lewis remained on the racetrack, whereas when it was the other way around, and particularly like in Brazil, they both, and again here this weekend, they both ended up going off the racetrack. But what are we saying? How are we defining whether one's okay and one's not? Are we saying that if the driver on the inside stays within the white lines, that's okay? Or two wheels inside the white line? I mean, what are we saying? That's the point I'm trying to make. There's no clear definition on what's okay and what isn't. Not a great example for young kids driving karts. Look, right, so what I want to say here, okay, first of all, is that my actual overall opinion on this is I think those moments are great. I think those are the moments, if you ever look at a highlights reel of Formula One, it's of moments like that. It's of moments when two title rivals go wheel to wheel, you know, and maybe one of them ends up on the runoff area. Maybe they end up touching wheels. Those are the great moments that we live for in Formula One. We don't see in the highlights reels the moment where the driver on the outside backs out of an overtake because he's run out of room to go around the outside, do we? They're not the highlights. They're not the moments that make this sport great. So I want to see this kind of racing where it's safe to do so. Obviously, you go to somewhere where there's a wall on the outside, you can't do that. And the drivers will police that themselves because, well, for obvious reasons, they're going to end up out of the race if they go into a gap that suddenly disappears against a wall. When the circuit lends itself to a bit of runoff area where you can go for a big lunge, you can go wheel to wheel all the way through that corner, I want to see it. I don't want to see drivers having to back out and give up a corner because the rules state they're going to get a penalty otherwise. I want to see it being able to let go and let them do it. But I want to see that being applied everywhere we go to everybody. And yes, of course, if there becomes a very dangerous situation, the stewards are there to step in, and we've got rules that will cover that through dangerous driving and causing a collision. Those are separate things. Those are things that we are already covered in the regulations for, and the stewards have free rein to step in when they think a line has been crossed. What's happened in my mind in recent years is that it's become so over-regulated, so over-policed, that drivers now are wary and not even knowing what they can and can't get away with. And Brazil was a very big precedent setter for me. Given that it was only a couple of races ago, it's fresh in everyone's mind. It's no wonder that Max feels like it's okay to go into those corners very, very late on the brakes, running up the inside or the outside, knowing that, you know, he's got the freedom within the regulations to go and do that. That's my feeling on it. The stewards, in my opinion, have allowed, or stewards/race control, have allowed this to get to this point. So if we don't like what we're seeing in Qatar in terms of those incidents, perhaps we need to look not just at the drivers and the way they're driving and their driving standards, but more so towards the regulators for allowing the racing to get to this point without stepping in, if indeed we do want to step in. Right. What do you think of Max's driving style? I think it's aggressive, I think it's entertaining, I think it's box office. I think at times what Max has definitely shown, even more so than ever this weekend, is that he is willing to crash rather than lose a race. And, you know, is that right or wrong? I don't believe that I want to see any driver going in absolutely reckless without being under control at all times and without, you know, a care of safety for himself and for other drivers, marshals, people around the racetrack. We can't get to a point where we are driving Formula One cars like we're playing computer games. And some people will say that's exactly what Max did this weekend. And I think he overstepped the mark, let's be clear, this weekend. I think Max was too aggressive. But on the flip side of that, he's built up a points lead in this championship before this weekend that earns him the right to be a bit more, to play a bit more risk when it comes to racing. Lewis, through the course of his championship, is behind Max on points, and so therefore hasn't earned that right to throw a bit more caution to the wind. Because of Lewis's championship points position, he is forced into being a bit more risk averse, and that's the difference between the two drivers, particularly in yesterday's race. Now, of course, you can say they both perhaps have that tendency anyway, but in this championship, Max has earned his right to be able to throw one down the inside because, you know, Lewis has got more to lose. And that's come about because Max has won more races and scored more points. So there's an argument to say he's earned himself that right to some degree. We've got to keep a check on that it doesn't get, you know, ridiculously dangerous, but these are very safe Formula One cars. It seems like a circuit, particularly on the corners that we're talking about here, there was plenty of runoff area. I didn't see any of those incidents as necessarily outrageously dangerous. It's just about whether we think it's within the racing rules or not. And those are what are so incredibly vague right now. I can't believe you're condoning this. I'm not condoning dangerous driving. If you're talking about Max's driving style, I'm not condoning it as such. I think it's really entertaining and I want to see this kind of stuff happening. I don't want to see dangerous driving, and I definitely want to see skillful driving. Look, there were moments, the moment on the second restart where Max Verstappen lunged down the inside of Lewis and Esteban Ocon, I thought that was brilliant driving. It again came about because he's afforded himself the ability to take a bit more risk. If that had been Lewis on the inside, sitting in third position, would Lewis have taken that same risk in taking a very late lunge down the inside, potentially with the risk of Max, if it was in Lewis's position, turning in on him? Perhaps not, because they're in different championship positions, but I thought that one was a great one. It was under control, it was well executed, it jumped him from third place up to first place in a brilliant move. I thought there were moments when Lewis, and also, by the way, Lewis also did very, very well to go wheel to wheel with Esteban Ocon, and yes, they touched and he got away with it, but to navigate around that corner, actually Lewis to navigate through that entire race and get to the end, I thought was an incredible display of his skill and experience, because particularly of the fact that he had more to lose than Max in that Grand Prix. He had to get to the end. He had to get to the end, otherwise his championship would have ended yesterday. So his biggest focus was getting to the end of that Grand Prix in the best state that he could, but mostly just getting to the end. For Max, it was a slightly different set of challenges over the course of the day, wasn't it? He wanted to get in front of Lewis, he wanted to beat Lewis Hamilton. That was his biggest motivation. Finishing the Grand Prix or not was almost secondary to getting in front of him. And that's the two different mindsets, probably of both drivers anyway, but definitely of both drivers on the day yesterday because of their situations in the championship. Of course, going into next weekend, perhaps things change slightly, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. I think we've probably covered that. Should we move on? Because Lewis has mostly taken a conservative approach even when in the lead in previous years. Yeah, I think that's Lewis's style. He's a very clean driver. He's I think a driver that's hugely respected by all the other drivers, and that's because of the way he drives. I think, you know, people like Kimi are the same. Other drivers have a huge amount of respect, although Kimi made a horrific move on Sebastian Vettel this weekend. But I think, you know, Lewis has earned the respect of all of the other drivers because he has gone about his Formula One career almost in entirety in the right way. He's done things almost always in a correct and proper fashion. Now, would people say the same about Max? No, because at the moment, people are very wary of Max. You know, they don't want to be wheel to wheel with Max because they don't know what he's going to do. Now, is that right or wrong, or is it just the way Max is, and is it something that we should be embracing in Formula One? Personally, I kind of think the latter. I think we should be embracing the odd maverick in this sport. We don't want a grid of 20 robots who are all after you. No, after you. We want the odd guy who's willing to lay it all on the line. You know, it's a cross-section of the human race, isn't it? People have a different risk appetite. Amongst your own group of friends, amongst your family, there will be a massive variation in the risk appetite of those people. And of course, Formula One drivers are just a cross-section of the racing driver society. We're going to get different characters, and we want to see that coming through in the driving styles. It's what makes the sport colourful and interesting and entertainment. The last thing I want is us to ban all of that, is to push it out of the sport where we end up with 20 drivers who are just all the same, all saying the same things in the interviews in front of the cameras, all kind of being very polite and going one after the other single file around a racetrack, it's not going to make for a great sport. It's not going to make a great entertainment. So we need characters like a Max Verstappen. We need characters like a Kimi Räikkönen. We need the James Hunts of this world. We need the Ayrton Sennas, the Prosts. We need a mix of everybody. And that's kind of what we're watching here, which is what I think makes it so entertaining. I know that I will be annoying many of you with some of these opinions, particularly the ones who disagree. Yes, if all drivers are like Max, there'll be carnage every race. Well, there absolutely would. I mean, equally, you can't have a full grid of people like Max, can you? Because of the same reason. It would be the same, and yes, in that incident, you're probably going to get a huge number of crashes. So we need a mix. We've got a mix, but let's not try and throttle their characters. Let's just let them flourish and do what they let's see the different traits of the humans behind the wheel play out on the racetrack, is my thoughts on it. Right, I think we should probably move on here. Massively disagree, says Varun Sambi. Well, that's absolutely fine by me. I know that this is going to be the case. Yes, but Marc, Max would have to be the exception. The exception, not sure what the exception to what. I don't think, well, I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean. Sorry about the exception to what. You seriously don't see the advantage to Max taking out Lewis rather than giving up the lead? You're not that dumb. Look, if any of you genuinely believe that Max tried to wipe Lewis out with a view to Lewis not finishing and Max winning that Grand Prix yesterday, I mean, you're welcome, obviously welcome to your opinion, but I couldn't disagree more. I honestly don't think that's the case. I just don't think that would have crossed his mind. What he is, and that is very, very different to Max being willing to take a huge amount more risk. That's not the same thing as wanting to or being willing to wipe out Lewis Hamilton. First of all, how do you go into a crash and orchestrate a crash where you don't come off worse, like what happened at Silverstone, where Max ended up in the wall and Lewis carried on to win the Grand Prix after they collided? How do you possibly orchestrate things to work out in your favour? It's a massive gamble, and one that could backfire massively on you. So I just don't buy it, I'm afraid. He's a risk taker, he's a fighter, and as I say, much more so than Lewis Hamilton in terms of being a risk taker, because of course he can afford to do that, and his nature allows him to do that too. So there we go. That's what I'm saying on that one. Let's move it on, because there's so much more to talk about. Yeah, I know. Look, I'm not a Max fanboy or a Lewis fanboy. I'm just trying to give my unbiased opinion. I do think, by the way, just to clarify, both drivers, I think, are just exceptional, have been exceptional this year in different ways. And we've witnessed something very special over the course of this year, and are still witnessing it. Of course, we've got two groups of fans who are passionate about their guy winning, and I've seen some really quite nasty stuff playing out on Twitter and social media because of people's opinions bubbling over, almost like a football match here. It doesn't need to be like that. Let's just enjoy it. Whoever wins, whichever one of these two guys wins this championship, I think it's fair to say they will have deserved it. Because either of them could do. Either of the two drivers and their teams could deserve to win the championship. You'll have your own opinions if you don't like one of them. You'll say that he doesn't deserve it. But of course they do, because they've played an absolute blinder. Look how close they are. They're level on points. That's not by accident. They disappear up the road in every Grand Prix, leaving the rest of the grid behind, including their own teammates in the same car. These two drivers are exceptional and at the top of their game. Very different styles. They've got different cars that suit different tracks, and even different parts of different tracks where one excels and one doesn't so much. This is as close as it's ever going to be, and we are very lucky and privileged to be witnessing it. So that's what we should take from this overall. It's a special year. We're lucky to be here to watch it. Right, let's move it on. Where should we go next? What have we done? We've done. Let's talk about the handing the place back. So when Max gets told he needs to hand the place back, obviously the first, we get that moment where they collide. But then after that, he has to do it again because Lewis refused to overtake him. They collided. It didn't happen on that one. So then he gets told, right, you've got to do it again. So he lets him by again and then immediately ducks down the inside into the corner and takes the place back. Kind of caught Lewis snoozing a little bit in that moment. At first I thought, there are no specific rules to cover this. There's no wording that says you have to let somebody by and then wait 10 seconds before you can have another overtake or attack. It just doesn't work like that. There's no specific wording. This is a gentleman's agreement that plays out when the stewards or the race control think that something has been done, a place has been gained illegally outside of the rules, and rather than refer it to the stewards, race control will come on over the intercom to the team and say, look, we would expect we'd expect you to give that place back. And that's how you keep racing flowing. It's a sensible decision. It's happened for years, it happens. So there are no rules written in the regulations to cover that. It's just a kind of gentleman's word to say, let's get on with it. And so there's nothing to stop Max from doing that, other than perhaps precedents that may have happened in years gone by, and we know there are some. So I think what's happened then is race control have come back on and said, look, that's not okay. You can't just immediately lunge down the inside. We would expect Max to give that place back again. This communication unravels. And then it seemed to me, and I haven't heard the whole radio transcript yet, but it seemed to me like they took so long to actually allow that to make that happen, that in the meantime, they actually gave Max a 5-second penalty, at which point he then went on to swap the place back again, which was an unnecessary, kind of got done twice. I don't think it would have affected the result. It definitely wouldn't have affected the result. Lewis was quicker. Max's tyres were going off. It was only a matter of time anyway. And if Max had the 5-second penalty, it was a no-brainer Lewis was going to win that Grand Prix. And I think that's the overriding point from all this. The result in that Lewis won, Max came second, is the result based on performance. That was the right result if you look at the performance of the two drivers and their cars, the way the teams played it on strategy. Mercedes just got it right with Lewis. He was quicker and in that regard deserved to win. Max wasn't as quick and so but was way quicker than everyone else, deserved to come second on the racetrack. But it was a whole load of communication breakdowns across this entire Grand Prix between Lewis and his team, between Max and his team, between the FIA and the teams in general. And I think that's what we should come on to really, is this idea of communication between teams and race control, notably Michael Massey. We said we'd talk about him. We've only got 15 minutes left. I can't believe how quick this has gone. Hold on. I just saw a good one there. Thoughts on Massey, yeah. So let's get on to this. So this communication between the teams. We've got to talk about this idea of Michael Massey coming on the radio to Jonathan Wheatley saying, listen, here's an offer for you at the red flag. Here's an offer for you. How about you drop back behind Esteban Ocon, or behind Lewis rather. Well, he actually said Esteban first and he got that wrong. Drop behind Lewis and, we'll say no more about it. And then for Jonathan to go away and say, well, all right, give us a minute, Michael, we'll come back to you on this one. As if to say, we'll decide whether or not to accept that. That's not how this sort of stuff typically works. It was a strange thing. The reason it was so strange is that we've never heard these communications. I have, obviously, having been in the team. I've heard these kind of communications a lot. We don't hear them on the radio being played out on the TV. And it seemed like a very, very strange thing to, first of all, to be saying and hearing, but secondly, to have that played out on the telly. I don't think anybody came out of that looking good. Those are the kind of communications, in my view, we shouldn't be airing. I don't like this idea of the FIA and the team's channel being broadcast. I don't think anyone comes out looking good. Historically, the teams and the race director have these conversations all the time. If there's a moment on track, you can guarantee that the guy from your team, the team manager, will be on that button immediately saying, hey, Michael, did you see what he just did? That's unacceptable. He deserves a penalty. We don't want to be hearing that. It's just messy. It's not elegant. It just makes everybody look petty and silly. It's what happens behind the scenes, but we don't need to see it happening or hear it happening, in my view. But this idea of making an offer, then deciding whether or not to accept the offer, seemed utterly bizarre. What should have happened in my mind is that Michael Massey should have come on and said, Hey Jonathan, I want you to give the place back and take the restart behind Lewis Hamilton, or we'll have to I'll have to refer it to the stewards, in which case they can dish out whatever penalty they deem fit. That's how that communication should have gone. And the fact that we did hear it has reinforced in many people's minds, I'm sure many of your minds, that Michael Masi isn't fit for purpose, isn't up to the job. He doesn't come across well in many of those communications. But look, Charlie Whiting would have had many of those conversations, and many of them wouldn't have made him look good either. I don't want to completely back up Michael Masi here, because I think they have made some massive errors that they're now paying the price for, as I alluded to earlier. That, I think, was one of them, and the fact we heard it just made it worse and worse. But it was a bizarre scenario to hear, deal or no deal. Exactly, that's what it sounded like. Absolutely. Right, someone's saying, in my view, it makes it more exciting. Look, I get that we want as much access as possible, but, I mean, does it making it exciting? I think it's one of those things that those kind of communications often appear petty, and it forms our opinions. And don't forget, we don't hear anywhere near all of them. We hear the ones the TV director decides we should hear. It forms our opinions of those teams and of Michael Masi, because if we get to hear ones that don't make them look favourable, that goes into our data banks, and that's how we form an opinion of that person or that team. And it can really change. It can sway public opinion massively. And we touched on this last week. Public opinion can make a difference to the people fighting in those teams. I don't want to go over that again because we covered it in detail last week, but public opinion is not just a sort of throwaway thing. It can make a difference. It can be important. Hey Mark, do you think it's possible that Marc somehow got a cheater engine into Lewis's car? No, I don't. Bottas driving. Well, let's just finish quickly on the Masi thing. Masi is inconsistent, and penalties seem to be based on outcome, not the offence. Well, let's be clear, Michael Masi doesn't issue penalties. That's the stewards, that's not Michael Masi. So when something's referred to the stewards, that then leaves the control of Michael Masi. It goes to the group of stewards who then decide and issue a penalty. Michael Masi decides whether something should be referred to the stewards or not. But he's also the person who does have the immediate conversations and communication with the teams. This whole idea, by the way, of the communication around the collision between Max and Lewis, I know I've covered it massively, but the idea that it seemed like it came across on the telly like Michael Masi had given an instruction to Max, but then later and only afterwards gave the information to Lewis in terms of their teams as to what was going to happen. It wasn't quite like that. It was what happens in these scenarios is Michael Masi would have come on to Red Bull and said, look, guys, I need you to give the place back. That was overtaking, was off the racetrack. You need to give the place back. Then what happens is Red Bull have a little bit of a conversation about how they're going to do that. So at some point in that, we're talking a few seconds, Jonathan Wheatley would come back on to Michael Masi and say, yeah, understood, Michael. We've instructed Max to give the place back. So at that point, Red Bull have instructed Max to give the place back. Then what's probably happened is Michael Masi gets on the phone to Mercedes and says, okay, guys, we've instructed Red Bull to give the place back. Max is going to do it along this straight. And it was that short delay from the conversation happening between Red Bull and Michael Masi, but also in the same period, Red Bull instructing Max to give the place back. That short delay was probably what the difference that you heard people talking about on TV. It's not that Michael Masi chose to give some information to Max before he chose to give it to Lewis. It's not how these things, how the workflow works. It's just, of course, there's going to be a delay because Red Bull are the ones informing Michael Masi that they're about to give the place back, so they know beforehand. I hope that makes sense. I still don't think that was really what caused the issue at all, because, as I said before, why was Lewis slowing down if he hadn't had an instruction? You just go past. But anyway, we've covered that. So yes, I think Michael Masi and race control as a whole could have done a lot of things better. Not just this weekend. I think this weekend they suffered as a result of decisions made earlier, i.e. the one in Brazil. But I think they could have definitely cleared up communication a lot more. Right, let's... and also, by the way, as somebody says here, ZR Lee, Massey is doing a very difficult job, in my opinion. And you are absolutely right, ZR Lee. I couldn't agree more. It is a job that I don't think anyone else would want to do. An incredibly difficult job, particularly right now, in the circumstances we've got. We're going into a championship decider with the two title protagonists on the same points. The pressure for Michael Massey and race control and the stewards is going to be immense. And let's make no pretense around this. The stewards, of course, are going to be involved in some stuff next weekend. It's unthinkable to try and assume that it won't happen. There's going to be something, whether it is an on-track moment or a protest. These two teams and drivers will do whatever they can to gain themselves an advantage, even if it's by taking something away from the opposition team through protesting and trying to get them penalised. Of course they're going to do that. We've seen it happen all season on both sides. There's nothing to suggest it won't happen next weekend. Imagine the pressure being in that room, trying to make a decision on a penalty that you know could affect the world title. That's big. So tough job, and you've got to give them all some respect for stepping up and doing it, including Michael Massey. Right, we've got 10 minutes. God, what we've got to cover? What else we've got to cover? Can we talk about race implications if they crash next weekend? Well, if they crash, I mean, you know that if they crash and they both don't finish, we know that Max wins on countback of having more race victories. Do I think that will play any part in Max's mind in terms of that will be a tactic? No, I don't think so at all. I don't think Max is... Whatever you think of Max, I don't think he's that kind of character. Will he be less risk averse than Lewis Hamilton? Probably, because that's in his nature. And it's winner takes all. So that's what we want, isn't it? We want... Everything's got to be on the line next weekend, because if you finish second to your title rival, you've lost. So you have to finish first. So you can assume that both drivers will give it everything and be willing to lay a lot more risk on the line to get in front of the other guy. I just think that's how it's going to be from Lewis and from Max, because finishing second, you may as well finish last. It's not going to do you anything. Winning is all that matters, assuming they're both out in front. So they've got to have a strong weekend all the way through. Yes, of course, qualifying is going to be crucially important. When it comes to the race, though, it's the gloves are going to be off. And that's exactly what I want to see. I want to see both drivers laying it all on the line with a winner-takes-all Grand Prix. That's going to be epic, surely. So look, let's talk about next weekend quickly. Let's finish up with that, because I know there's plenty of stuff we haven't really covered. But there's just too much. Let's talk about next weekend. We're going to Abu Dhabi. Yes, you can say, well, last year Max and Red Bull dominated that weekend. They did. This year, I believe that things will be a lot closer. First of all, just because the two cars and drivers are neck and neck. Seemingly nothing between them, very little anyway. It's a racetrack which has changed dramatically from last year. And actually the changes look quite good in terms of it's not the most exciting racetrack actually in history, especially not for a title decider, but we've made some major changes. I think the race lap is about 5 seconds a lap quicker this year than it was in the previous configuration. There's a massive braking zone into that really tight hairpin, instead of having the sort of twisty chicane before the hairpin. So now we come into the hairpin really fast, big wide braking zone, massive chance to lunge down the inside, take different routes, different lines through the hairpin and get back onto that long straight. So that, I think, could be quite exciting. So there's lots of difference this year. There's nothing to say previous form will absolutely carry over to this one. But we also know that it's a racetrack that has very long straights on it, and we know the straight line speed of Lewis typically is quite good. Some of the sort of 90-degree corners have been opened out a little bit to make them a little bit faster too. So there are some different challenges, of course, across this particular Grand Prix this year. I don't know which way it's going to go, but that's what's so good about it. There's nothing to suggest this should suit one driver over the other massively. And that's amazing, isn't it? Surely. Imagine, by the way, what it feels like to be inside both of those garages going into this Grand Prix. And I can tell you from experience, having been there on a couple of occasions, going into the final race with your driver in with a shout of winning the title. I mean, I've luckily been there on quite a few occasions. And those of you who've read my book, let's sort of finish up with this little story. Those of you who've read my book may have remembered there was a story in there about when I first got to McLaren as this young kid, you know, like a rabbit caught in the headlights. I was just in this dream world, dream come true job, amazing place, in awe of the people. And I remember talking to a guy, Drew, who I'm still friends with today, who had just stepped down from the race team. He was Mika Häkkinen's tyre man, and he just retired from racing and had come back into the factory. And I just got into this world thinking this is my dream job. And I went up to him after the season and said, mate, what on earth are you doing? We're trying. Why on earth have you decided to leave? Why are you not going to racing anymore? I don't get it. I'd give my right arm to have that job that you've just walked away from. And he said, look, I was on the grid in Brazil or wherever it was the last race with Mika Häkkinen on the brink of a world title. He said, I took the tyre blankets off Mika's car on the grid, ready for the race start. And he said, I was shaking with fear, hoping that I'd put the right tyres on or set the right pressures or, got everything absolutely right. Every tyre blanket, he said, I opened, I was paralysed with fear. And he said, when I got to that point and realised that I was so scared about the consequences of getting this wrong, I couldn't do my job properly, and I realised that the fun had gone out of it because I was terrified. The pressure had got to me. And it stuck with me forevermore. I mean, I never felt that because I loved the pressure, but I definitely understood what he meant, because you go into these moments and all the focus is on the drivers. We'll all be looking at Max and we'll be looking at Lewis, but the guys and girls around that team, in that garage, in the pit stop crew, cannot afford to make a single mistake. A mistake from one of them could be as costly as a mistake from Lewis or Max on the racetrack. And yet all the focus is on those guys. So sitting away, bubbling behind the scenes, are these two teams of people like you and I, normal people who have the influence and the pressure on their shoulders that they can affect, both positively and negatively, one of the world's biggest sporting events. Imagine that. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people watching what you're doing, cheering for your driver, passionately wanting your guy to win, and being incredibly angry and upset and disappointed if your guy doesn't win. And imagine being the guy who might have done something wrong that causes that to happen. It is debilitating pressure for some people. So when you're watching this weekend and enjoying the spectacle, the build-up, the entertainment, spare a thought for those people in the garages, the guys and girls who are probably sitting there shaking, buckled with nervousness and pressure and fear as the race unfolds on Sunday afternoon. No matter which way it goes, there's going to be one team incredibly happy, another team that's going to be heartbroken. The dreams that they have had, probably as long as any of these drivers have had them, the holy grail, getting that close, and then for one of those teams will just disappear and no one will ever remember how close they got other than them. So there's a lot more to this than just Lewis and Max. That's what I'm saying. It's hopefully going to be an epic weekend, and I really can't wait for it. I've just seen a lot of people here talking about the red flag rule and the tyres. I agree with all of you that's saying it's a stupid rule. Why on earth are we allowed to put new tyres on under a red flag? I don't buy anything that says that was thrown as a red flag to help Max. Come on, let's not go down that route. It was a safety issue, and you can't ever argue with that. Of course, that was the right call to make. Those moments, though, can either win or lose a Grand Prix. We saw it help out Lewis Hamilton earlier in the year in Imola. We saw it massively help out Max in that moment in the Grand Prix yesterday. So, silly rule, we don't need it. Let's make sure we can get rid of it in the future. I can't think of an upside to it. Unless your tyres are damaged, just stick with it. Keep going. We're going to restart the race. It's just a pause. That's how it should be looked at. It's just a pause in the Grand Prix. Anyway, blimey, we've got through a lot. I'm almost out of breath, and I've not even managed to have a swig of beer yet tonight. Thank you all so much for such passionate comments. I mean, I appreciate all of you, whether you agree or disagree, whether you hate what I've said, whether you think I'm a complete idiot. That's fine. You're welcome to all of that opinion. The fact that this season has got to this point has generated so much passion that we're having heated conversations, and I'm sure we'll have these conversations with our friend groups and online for days, if not weeks, maybe even months to come. This is the season that just has delivered right from day one, and it's going to deliver right to the very last day. I hope you all have a fantastic week. Enjoy the weekend, whichever side of the fence you're sitting on. Try and be appreciative of what the other ones are going through. Try and be kind. Try not to be a dick if it doesn't work out for you. And let's all just try and enjoy it and appreciate what a spectacle we're all lucky enough to witness this weekend and, of course, this year. Have a great one, folks. Thank you ever so much. I will see you next Monday. Ta-da!